Thank you, viewers, for joining us at Climate Week New York. And we here at We Don't Have Time do not shy away from those tough conversations. This one is uniquely tough in the sense that what is harder to decarbonize than heavy transport and construction? We're going to get into all of it. And we're going to start with a fireside chat with the administrator of the General Services Administration, Robin Carnhan. Robin, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's great to be here. I didn't know this was going to be tough. For us, it's just been really fascinating and fun.
It's fascinating and fun. The reality is it's challenging to decarbonize these hard to abate sectors, right? But let's talk about how to do it. That's the whole point of this conversation. And nobody's better positioned to actually tackle it than you and the role that you play in the federal government that our viewers might not be too familiar with. So let's start with that. What is the role of GSA? And to what extent, how does the role of GSA actually influence markets and innovation through this procurement and policy that it gets behind?
Yeah, great question. So the U.S. General Services Administration was set up 75 years ago by President Harry Truman. It turns out it was because the executive branch wasn't very well organized and he wanted to make government work better and save money. So that's why we were put into place. And originally our job was to manage all the real estate transactions and holdings of the United States. But we now have expanded beyond that. So we have the largest commercial real estate holdings in the country. We also have the biggest fleet of vehicles, along with the Defense Department and the Postal Service. We're the biggest buyer of goods and services. We buy $100 billion worth of goods and services every year. We're, along with the Defense Department, the biggest buyer of power. So we really, in that capacity, have the ability to move markets. And so we're working on that when it comes to the big, ambitious goals of the Biden-Harris administration when it comes to decarbonization. So here's what we're doing. When it comes to let me just say, we got about $7 billion extra beyond our normal budget in the infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. So we've been able to invest that in ways that really does sort of signal that the government wants to lead by example here.
Sure.
So we're doing it with low embodied carbon building materials, which is really, really interesting. And if you want to talk about that, I can go into that further. We're doing it with carbon-free electricity procurement. And we're doing that with vehicles, electric vehicles, and transitioning the federal fleet.
Let's go into the materials, actually. Okay. Give us an example. Let's probe a little bit deeper into an example of this purchasing power that's actually changing this landscape in terms of a faster transition to clean energy and meeting our ambitious net zero goals.
Yeah. So who would have thought I'd be so interested in concrete, asphalt, glass, and steel? But it turns out those are major polluters, and we buy a lot of it as the government. So one of the things we're trying to do is give a signal to the market and ask if they can do it with less emissions in the chain of production. And what's been really fascinating is across the board, industry has said, yeah, we can do that. And the price premium is shockingly low. So let me give you an example. So I was out at a 5th generation concrete plant outside of Kansas City not long ago. And they were telling me about injecting carbon into the mix of concrete, which, as you know, is gravel, sand, water, and Portland cement in some, recipe. And when you inject the carbon, you can take out some of the Portland cement. So net, they were making more money. I was paying the same as the buyer of a lot of concrete. And I said to the gentleman who's 5th generation in this business, why haven't you done this before?
Right.
Guess what he said?
What?
No one's ever asked. And so guess what? The government is now asking, and industry is totally stepping up. So I've gone to glass manufacturers, same situation, asphalt, same thing. And so we're putting this into the market, and it's not just going to be ultimately the government buying, it's going to be everybody buying. And that's good across the board.
So these are the targets that the federal government has set for our country. And then there's ambitious targets you have for within your administration as well, which is 100% zero emission light duty vehicle acquisitions by 2027. And all of this, of course, feeds up to the bigger, the bigger global ambition, right? And the contribution that the United States makes to the UN nationally determined contributions. But again, this particular role is significant in getting us there. So these acquisitions of light-duty vehicles by 2027, zero-emission fleet acquisitions by 2035. So talk to us some more about the different high-impact programs that you're implementing to achieve these goals, because ultimately we need to globally transition away from fossil fuels.
Right. Look, it often is hard when you're in the middle of a transition to sort of understand what's really going on, but you've got to just show what's possible. And that's what we're trying to do at GSA and in the federal government with vehicles. The way we're trying to make it, I always talk about making it easy for people to say yes to the things we like them to do, right? So that means making sure they have vehicles that meet their mission, because the missions aren't all the same. If you're in the park service, it's one thing. If you're in security, it's another thing. If you just have a regular, duty job, it's something else. If you're in transit, it's something else. So we have to make sure we're meeting the mission. We also have to make sure they have charging infrastructure set up so that that's easy for them. And the other piece that people don't always think about is the security piece, cybersecurity. So we're also the place where it's called FedRAMP, and that's where any of these charging infrastructures that connect to the cloud have to meet security protocols to go into the government. So we're helping push that through as well. So yeah, we've had a big increase. We've got a long way to go, but I'm optimistic that we can continue to make great progress.
So those were some great examples. And now you're also, like you said right in the beginning, you are the government's landlord. You didn't say that, but you are basically the government's landlord. The amount of infrastructure, the amount of buildings that you're responsible for. So what is it, how do we lower carbon footprints of buildings? What role can GSA play in that portion of this? What is the lowest hanging fruit really to decarbonize buildings?
Yeah, look, I think there are lots of things we can do, and we're focused on that at GSA. The first has got to be efficiency. Right, we know that 40% of power goes to the built environment. We know that 42% of emissions are from the built environment. So if we can stop the leakage and stop the waste in the built environment, we can have a big impact. And so with this big portfolio, that's a thing that we can, again, lead by example on. And so efficiency is number one. How are we doing that? First, we're teaming up with private sector partners to do what we call deep energy retrofits with energy service contracts that can cut emissions 40-50% straight up by putting in new windows, new lighting systems, ground source heat pumps, other things. And so a lot of our buildings are getting those investments. We've got about $1 billion to do that, but we're also leveraging that with private sector money to be about $2 billion worth of impact. So we think that that's a neat opportunity. We also put new products into our buildings, and we have a thing called the Green Proving Ground, which is really fascinating because it's hundreds of companies that have something to do with building efficiency. It might be one company out in Colorado does quad pane windows. We put those in some of our federal buildings to test it in the wild. The payback, listen to this, the payback, 2.5 years. Think about that.
Yeah.
So that's pretty great. So we can put that in our federal buildings because our portfolio, some is really old, some's new, everything in between.
Yeah.
So we're testing these out, and then we're connecting these companies with those ESCOs, right, that do these kind of deep energy retrofits across the board, including outside of government. So that's one thing we're doing.
And this is good for the planet. It's good for taxpayers.
Of course. That's the thing. I always talk about this stuff as a triple win, right? It's great for jobs and innovation in America. It is great for saving money, because if you reduce your energy costs, you're saving money for taxpayers. And it's great for the planet and your community and your kids. So
win-win-win.
It's a triple win. But the other thing we're doing is carbon-free electricity. And so in doing that, we're teaming up with utilities to say we're looking for, as a buyer, 24/7 carbon-free electricity matched to your grid production at least half of the time. And interestingly, the first agreement we entered into in a green tariff was in the state of Arkansas, where they stepped up very quickly to do that. Because the fact is, it wasn't just the government asking for this as a big buyer with the biggest buyer of power, but it was industry asking for it. And so the state is able to use their ability to deliver carbon-free electricity matched to their grid as a selling point for economic development in their state. So we're doing that same thing in regions all across the country.
It sounds like this is all going in the right direction. Is it going fast enough?
Well, look, we're all impatient about this, and there's a lot of urgency that we know we share. But the way you scale this is you get started and show what's possible.
Yep.
And in the end, if it's not commercial, it's not really sustainable. And so we're showing that you can actually do these things that are all commercially beneficial, but also great benefits for the climate.
So it's so great that you're here and you're explaining all of this, and we have an audience tuning in from the US and around the world. My whole thing is that we just need to communicate some of this. And it will reach the right ears, and with the right messaging, it will result in behavioral outcomes, even if it's just simply support, right? Or whatever your voting behavior is going to be. So is that what's missing here, the communication aspect of it?
Well, look, I think it's all our responsibility to communicate this. But I will tell you, when I travel around the country, I go to union job training centers who are training electricians to, put solar panels on buildings and have microgrids and figure out how to do charging infrastructure. This is a standard thing that our union brothers and sisters are doing. They're out there creating good paying jobs. And I see this everywhere. I was just down in Zion National Park where we rolled out the first electric bus fleet for the National Park Service that's going to make a huge difference for every visitor that goes through that park. So, yeah, we need to keep telling the story.
We need to tell the
but
stories.
There are great examples of how this is, again, the triple win of highlighting good American jobs and innovation, saving money for taxpayers, and making our planet and our communities healthier. It's all good.
Well, thank you for sharing some of these stories with us today. Thank you for sharing it with our audience that may not be here in person at Climate Week New York. And this is a critical moment leading up to the US election, leading up to COP29 in Azerbaijan. And so the decisions that are being made today and the different actions that are underway in the federal government are really going to be reaping rewards and benefits, if done correctly, for coming years and coming decades. So thank you for the work that you do, the decisions you make, and keeping our government honest and carbon friendly. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Welcome, viewers, to Climate Week New York, and We Don't Have Time's broadcast. And we don't have time, for those of you who tune into us year after year, know that we like to have tough conversations, especially about those sectors that may be more difficult to decarbonize. That doesn't mean they can't be, and these conversations aren't always easy, but it's those conversations we really need to have if we're going to see a world that is cleaner and more breathable. And so we are going to have some real tough talk today about heavy transportation and construction. I'm so thrilled to introduce the four panelists. We have coming in via Zoom, Congressman Don Beyer, who is the U.S. representative for Virginia's 8th District. Welcome, Congressman. We also have with us Congressman Sean Casten, who is the U.S. representative for Illinois' 6th District. Welcome, Congressman Casten. And we have in studio with us in New York City, Lynda Tran. She is the former senior advisor to U.S. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg and Director of Public Engagement for the U.S. Department of Transportation. Pleasure to have you in studio, Lynda.
Great to be with you.
And Karin Svensson, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer of Volvo Group and has had decades-long career at Volvo Group. And so I'm going to have to kick this off with you because you have really been in the weeds on this in various roles over your career and can really attest to how much it's changed, not within industry, but in the environment that the industry is operating in. So talk to us about broadly these sectors, heavy construction and heavy transportation and construction. How challenging is it to decarbonize these sectors? And how is Volvo Group tackling the challenges that are unique to these sectors? And I'll leave it there for now, but I do want to know what you're also excited about and optimistic about. But let's start with the challenges.
Yeah, so a great question. We have an ambition to become net zero by 2040 throughout the value chain. If we look upon our emissions, more than 95% of our emissions comes from downstream. So that means when our trucks, buses, construction equipment are actually being used. To tackle that, electrification will be key. We have, however, a three-pronged approach. So we think about battery electric, fuel cell electric, but also keeping the internal combustion engine, but then filled with something, with some kind of renewable energy. Already today, we have come quite far. So you can buy an electric bus. You have been able to do that for more than 10 years. You can buy an electric truck. This year, Volvo trucks have 8 models, electric trucks, in serial production. And next year we will launch another one, an electric truck with a range of 600 kilometers. Also on the construction side, there is a possibility already today to buy many of our models, and they are running with customers in real operation already today in different work sites. On top of that, we are also decarbonizing upstream on the supply side. So we're looking into different types of materials and components, steel being one. So already 2022, we actually had the world first truck parts in low carbon steel, and we are adding more and more low carbon steel into our products. On top of that, we're also looking into other materials like aluminium, polymers, and batteries.
So it looks like a lot of innovation is already here, and there's still some challenges that are going to affect makers like you from being able to produce at the capacity that you're hoping to, and to really see some of these innovations reach fullest potential, fullest commercial potential. So Representative Casten, I'm going to come to you with this question. We've heard from Karin about the different innovations that are already in the market, that are in the pipeline. From your experience, what are the bottlenecks that are still being faced? And you have a background as a scientist, as an entrepreneur, so you also can see beyond just the policy challenges. What can you talk to us about in terms of policy, in terms of technology, that is preventing us from really rapidly scaling some of these solutions?
So thanks for having us on and for doing this. In the industrial sector, if you look at our electrification sector, if we electrify everything, it's relatively straightforward to envision how we could get to 100% zero carbon electric system. It's really just a capital deployment problem. We don't have particular challenges with the technologies that are out there once they get deployed. And by the way, they are all cheaper than the alternative. Sometimes that's their challenge, frankly, and some of the regulatory challenges that vested incumbents are not particularly fond of lower cost competition coming into market. The hard thing in the industrial sector is really twofold. Number one, we have these sectors that use fossil fuel not as a source of energy, but as a chemical. When the steel industry uses met coke, they're using that to scavenge oxygen, and they need something to be that scavenger of oxygen. When the fertilizer industry uses natural gas, they're using it because they want something that can take those little hydrogen atoms and staple them onto a nitrogen atom. And those sectors are really hard to decarbonize in many cases because we don't even know what the technologies are yet, but we know that we need those products and materials. One of the first bills I introduced when I got elected 6 years ago was the Clean Industrial Technology Act, specifically to put R&D into those, but also to do deployment. And this is the second challenge that we really need to work with the industrial sector to address. Any capital intensive commodity industry is extremely risk averse and hesitant to change. If you're making 2-3% margins, taking a bet on a future technology is not a way you get promoted. The steel industry, the cement industry, the fertilizer industry, these industries are basically run by their purchasing department. And that makes it both trivially easy to identify opportunities where they could lower their costs and decarbonize, but also extremely difficult to actually get them to take that bet. And so we need government policy that develops those technologies, helps provide some of that high-risk capital early on, and then broadcast their success so that companies now see this as a low-risk opportunity going forward. And that's what we've done with the Loan Program Office, with some of the DOE initiatives. We're not doing enough, we're not doing it fast enough, but we are pushing in the right direction.
Congressman Beyer, let me come to you. Do you agree with what Congressman Casten just described? And what further is needed from Congress to really incentivize innovation for these types of sustainable technologies in these hard-to-abate sectors? I'm curious about your thoughts on heavy-duty vehicles like trucks, and how do we keep up with the growing demand for fleets for these heavy-duty vehicles?
Well, first, I agree with everything that Congressman Casten says, always. Sean's easily the smartest and the best informed member of the House and the Senate on decarbonization. Every time I hear him, I learn something new, and I'm grateful for his leadership. And I am just the fact that we're having this conversation about corporate engagement in the decarbonization of the heavy truck and industrial thing is so encouraging. The public sector, the Congress and state legislatures cannot do it alone. We're still going to need a lot of leadership. So having Volvo Group here, I confess I was a Volvo car dealer for 46 years, and Volvo trucks are made in Dublin, Virginia. So great affection for your leadership, Karin. But having said that, the one role we do have, and I'm a member of Ways and Means, so I tend to look at everything through a tax lens, is to use tax policy to encourage and stimulate this growth within those manufacturing sectors that are involved. For example, one of the things we did in the Inflation Reduction Act is the Green Van Act. It was one of my two little pieces in that big bill that created a 30% tax incentive for EVs, but not limited to cars, specifically for the commercial sector. And somehow Joe Manchin missed the fact that we didn't put a domestic content requirement in it, which was really helpful because we're fighting the domestic content requirement, which is holding us back in a lot of other sectors. So we are seeing enormous growth in the commercial EV sector right now because of that 30% tax credit. So we need to sustain this. We need to build on it in the years to come and use the tools we have to make sure that corporate America has not just the tech, but also the financial incentive to get on board.
So Lynda, thank you for that, Congressman Beyer. What are we not thinking about here? As somebody who has been a senior advisor in federal government, in transportation, it's one of the most senior levels you could be in. What is it that federal policy needs to do to support all of the efforts and the various bills that Representative Casten has introduced to Congress? What support does the federal government need to provide? So in terms of skilled workforce or those different aspects that are not so obvious to us, but are very much part of this conversation, what are we not thinking about that you would like to bring to our attention?
Well, first of all, I want to agree wholeheartedly with my fellow panelists about how exciting this period in our history is and how much optimism I feel about the future. The thing that I just spent the last 3 years of my life and 5,800 meetings I was telling Karin about a little bit earlier, the thing I spent most of my time talking about was infrastructure. The federal government, even as we're super encouraged to see nearly $900 billion in private sector manufacturing and clean energy investments, the federal government's job is to make sure that consumers feel like they have the confidence to do the great American road trip because they're going to have a charging station everywhere they go. They need to feel the confidence that if you're talking about the supply chain and the space that Karin is working in, that the trucks that are going to be heavier because batteries are heavier are going to be operating on roadways that we have invested hundreds of billions of dollars in, bridges that are strengthened, improved, and just ready to handle this clean future. So infrastructure. But to your point, Sweta, workforce is important as well. We often talk about just transition and how we want to make sure that we're racing into this future, but we're not leaving working people behind. And so one of the other things that I found very encouraging, and that of course the Biden-Harris administration has invested heavily in, is how do we upskill, reskill, and make sure that as we are creating these clean energy jobs, we're also thinking about people who are just trying to live their lives and put food on the table. I've been very excited to have the opportunity to see, for example, some of the workforce hubs that we have in place all around the country, or they have in place. I'm still having an identity crisis, clearly. And also just some of the private sector collaborations with community colleges, with labor unions, et cetera. It's a yes and approach, and I think it's very exciting.
So if we are able to build this infrastructure up, and if we're able to build the workforce up, and we're able to have products that are available to Americans and global citizens that are cleaner, then it's a no-brainer. This is something as a behavioral scientist I think about frequently, which is just give people better options and they'll take it, right? So this is something I know, Karin, you think about, again, through your career at Volvo Group, of how to just allow the consumer to make it easier for them to make the better choice. So what is it that you're excited about? What are the different innovation solutions, products that you're excited about that can really be used by the average consumer in the real world?
I think what is really exciting is that the products are already there. So, and we have good examples of customer using, driving an electric truck, or we have examples of work sites that are being electrified through different types of construction equipment machines, and it works. So I think that is really what excites me about this, that it's here.
But then there are a couple of things that is not really working, and that is some of the prerequisites that is needed to get this really to take off. Because what we see today is that we see customers being interested, customers wanting to take the step, but still we are lacking charging infrastructure in many places, in US, in Europe, elsewhere in the world. We are also lacking renewable or fossil-free energy to charge our vehicles with. We don't have enough of it, and we don't have the grid capacity that is needed. And then also the cost for our customers is still too high, so we need different types of incentives to make this happen.
I heard grid capacity, and I have to go to Representative Casten now with this, because of course you have been working with Representative Mike Levin on a bill that has more than 80 co-sponsors, and it's exactly on this issue. So please talk to us a little bit about why the grid is so critical to transitioning to the clean economy. Are we doing enough to support the build out of these grids?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for the shout out for Congressman Levin and I's clean electric, I forget, it's CETA, the bill. This is basically, we've got sort of all of the ideological support across the ideological divide of the diversity of the Democratic caucus on this bill. We put this together, and it really started with our friend Kathy Castor as well, after we had passed the Inflation Reduction Act. What we knew was that the single biggest barriers to realizing the goals of the Inflation Reduction Act, both to deploy clean energy and to reduce inflation, because clean energy and cheap energy are synonymous. The biggest barriers are, number one, our economy is consistently creating jobs faster than workers. And we have to have a conversation about training and making it possible for people like women who have had children to get back into the workforce. And let's be honest, have a more thoughtful and less xenophobic conversation about our immigration policy. But the other barrier is our transmission policy. Over the last couple decades, we have consistently built gas pipelines at 2 to 3 orders of magnitude, so 10 to 100 times as many miles of gas pipeline in any given year as we build high voltage electric transmission. And that's caused energy developers to say, I'm going to build sites where I can get a grid hookup, not necessarily where it's needed on the system. And that's fine if you're building a gas turbine. It doesn't work so well if you're building a solar farm or a wind farm. You got to build it where the resource is. And of course, at the same time, we're seeing a huge electrification of industrial loads, electrification of our vehicle fleets, which is adding loads at various places. So if we don't make it easier for people to build transmission, we're not going to realize the cheaper, cleaner future we want. The barriers to that are primarily economic. Yes, we need permitting reform, but in the electric sector, more often than not, the folks who have the approval to decide whether to let your generation come into this network, your wire to come on, are making money at the current price and would prefer you not deploy a connection that's going to lower the price of power at that node, because then they don't make money. There's an old joke in the electric sector that asking a utility to interconnect to their grid is like asking a man to date his wife. It may well be in the national interest, but they're not going to approve it very quickly. And so what we tried to do in our bill is to first fix the profit incentives and make sure that the people who are responsible for managing our grid have an economic interest in lowering the cost of energy and lowering the congestion on the system and shortening the interconnection queue and helping their states meet their renewable energy targets. And if they have an economic interest, then it becomes much easier to talk about the permitting question. So what we've tried to do is to do both, but it is urgent that we do it. And Congressman Levin and I's frustration was that when the IRA was passed, we didn't have a legislative vehicle in place. There was this 11th hour effort by Senator Manchin that really hadn't put the thought into it. And so what we've tried to do this term is to put the thought in, get the diversity of knowledge in there, and have a vehicle ready so that when that window opens again, we can run through it.
So you brought up the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm going to turn to Lynda, who is a massive advocate for it as it was passing, as it's been rolling out. To what extent is this act playing a role in supporting that economic incentivizing that Representative Casten just brought up, right? Because that was the whole point of this, is we need to stimulate, if we're going to stimulate these sectors, we need to incentivize via some various instruments. That was the whole point of this act.
Yeah.
Talk to us about how you've seen, and this is what we talked about last year, exactly this time last year, this was our whole conversation, right? So bring us back to the kind of beginnings of it and where it stands now?
Well, the way I look at it is first we had the IIJA, or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and that was the foundation, right? We had $7.5 billion towards the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program and the Community Fueling and Infrastructure Program to set into place that infrastructure. That's the base. And then you have the IRA layered on top of it. And so there were a number of different programs that we plussed up on the resources because we wanted to have more investment in our communities. But importantly, you have the tax credits that you heard Congressman Beyer talk about earlier. If we want to be able to move in this direction and have the kind of future that we envision, you have to get consumers to actually buy the vehicles. I know I'm preaching to the choir as I look at Karin here. You have to make sure that companies are able to withstand that early capital investment and that they know that when they have put their money into these types of programs, that they're going to reap the benefits of it later. So a critical part of the federal government's role, whether it's on the execution and implementation side of it where I was, or it's the members who worked really hard to design the bills in the first place, the critical part of that is just sending signals to the private sector that this is happening, this is the direction we're going in, and you should feel good about the fact that you're making your own investments.
Okay, I hear that. And so coming back to you, Congressman Beyer, so as somebody who has been between that divide, the public-private divide, or rather maybe just as a salesman of private sector products, I'm curious to see how you see that collaboration really resulting in faster acceleration of these various various innovations across these sectors.
Yeah, that's the soul of the heart of the matter. And I think the real challenge for us on a show called We Don't Have a Time is to realize that we still need to have some great long-term thinking. Let me give you two great examples. One is in the Inflation Reduction Act, we included for the first time ever, a refundable tax credit for direct air capture. $180 per ton of carbon taken out of the air. That seems pretty long-term, but since we put that in place, there are now something like 40 companies started in the United States, profit-making companies that are relying on that refundable tax credit to reverse the 400 years we've been dumping carbon into the atmosphere with impunity. Now that's not going to change it overnight, but it makes it hopeful, especially for our kids. A second thing is all the investments in new energy sources, like hydrogen, green hydrogen, or I'm particularly interested in fusion energy. And again, people have been skeptical. It's been around, talked about it for 50 years, but there are now over 40 companies, private sector companies, where 95% of the capital has come from private businesses and individuals, not the government. The first reactors are due to be turned on in 2027 and 2028. We do that, all the electricity that Congressman Casten just talked about needing could suddenly be very much available. I worry about what Sean says about all the electricity providers not being excited about new low-cost energy. But it will be a very good thing for all of us when we make that happen. And again, government can't do it, but we can be the catalyst. We can be that last 2% or 5% that makes it happen much sooner than it would otherwise.
Okay, so you're explaining very clearly where the limitations, let's say, of the public sector falls when it comes to this. So I'm going to move back to private and see where you can pick up on this, Karin, to explain where do you see the collaboration being successful for both parties and ultimately for consumers and ultimately for the planet? Where do you think a relationship between public and private sector can really support the acceleration of progress and ultimately benefit from one another, right? We're trying to reinforce policies that support acceleration of innovation and at the same time get the public excited about innovation so policies can more easily get behind making them reach commercial viability. How do you see this relationship?
As I think I mentioned before, I think to get this transition really to work, we need to have all the different pieces in the ecosystem to move synchronized. And the first step, I think, in that is to share your plans. So we need to align on where we think we're going. So we need to be very transparent about our moves, and then also we need policymakers to be transparent. And then I think it's a lot about working together. We are trying to also take responsibility not only for producing trucks, which is our main job, but also to creating some of the prerequisites. For example, we are working with actually some of our biggest competitors to build charging infrastructure. We are also participating in dialogues around renewable energy. So I think it's really important to have this very close collaboration together with policymakers to understand in what pace and where different types of policies and incentives are needed to get this transition really going.
And so how can, Congressman Casten, how do you see this? What role can Congress play to really help invigorate what's happening through the private market and through consumer demand? What is still out there for Congress to be doing that we are willing to admit to the public?
Well, number one, I want to emphasize something that Congressman Beyer said, and I think corporate America, I think the American people owe Congressman Beyer a bigger debt of gratitude than they've given to him so far. What he and his colleagues did on the Ways and Means Committee to make these tax credits refundable is huge. And this is like a weird buzzwordy thing, but we have always provided tax credits. And tax credits are great if you have profits that you need to that you would like to offset. Well, that doesn't help much for an individual who might want to put solar panels on their roof, but didn't make enough money to get a tax credit last year. And paradoxically, it's actually a really bad tool to incentivize the people who are doing what we want to do, because if you're going out and building assets, then you're probably borrowing money, which means you're paying interest, which is reducing your taxable income. And then you've got depreciation on those assets, which is also offsetting your taxable income. And so we created this huge spider web of ridiculously complicated tax equity finance structures that were inefficient and kept people from deploying the incentives we're putting out. And one of the reasons that we struggled with it, you said, what are we willing to say publicly? One of the dirty secrets is that as members of Congress, we always go and ask for scores because we want to be fiscally responsible. And the Congressional Budget Office consistently says that it will cost taxpayers more to provide refundable tax credits than to provide normal, if you will, tax credits, primarily because they're so much more successful. If you want people to actually go out and build solar panels and you make it easy for them to access incentives, they'll build more solar panels. That's insane that we view that as a negative, and yet historically we've done that. So kudos to Don and his team for doing that. The other big thing, and we've talked about the Inflation Reduction Act and the IIJA. I realize that you've got two members of the House here, so let's beat up on the Senate. In the Senate, if we are going to make changes in U.S. energy policy that would make it possible for the private sector to make more money by doing the right thing, better align public interest with their profit incentives, that requires 60 votes because that's a change in policy. If, on the other hand, we want to use taxpayer dollars to drive a behavior that is otherwise antithetical to the interests of corporate America, that only takes 50 votes because we can do that through reconciliation. And so what happened in the Inflation Reduction Act, when we went from Build Back Better to the Inflation Reduction Act, the difference between those was the Senate realizing that they did not have the votes to break filibuster. And so they had to throw out every policy tool that didn't cost the taxpayer anything and only include those tax incentives. And that's not knocking the IRA. Those tax incentives are really important that they're there. But it is a choice made by the Senate to put the rights of 40 senators over the rights of 330 million Americans. I think it's a bad choice, but we know what we have to do because it was the changes in policy that were part of Build Back Better that all got left on the cutting room floor. We could do more than that. I think personally we are long overdue for an overhaul of our wholesale energy markets in the United States. We've got a whole electric regulatory system that was built on the idea that you can't control load, but you can control generation. And we're increasingly living in a world where the opposite is true. You can go in your Nest thermostat and change the temperature in your house right now, but it's hard to convince a wind turbine not to run when the wind's blowing. And some of the way that those economic structures in our energy markets are now not very well designed for the energy structure we have and are unduly penalizing what's always the cheapest source of load, which is at the end load. If we can help Volvo to make more money by shifting around when they run some of their more electric intensive operations. That's the cheapest way to serve new load, but those incentives aren't there. So we can do more, but what we're paced by is Senate procedural rules. And, as I like to remind people all the time, that the laws of physics, the laws of economics, those are non-negotiable. But the laws of the United States, and especially the laws of the Senate, can be fixed.
Okay, so obviously the House and the Senate need to come together on this, and we need to be able to walk across both party lines. And that is something that, Congressman Beyer, I'm going to ask you how you've been doing for so many decades now, especially in a state that you represent that tends to be conservative. And yet all of this that we're talking about seems like a no-brainer, right? It's better for all Americans if we go this route. And yet there is still pushback. How do you think about messaging on the benefits of decarbonization of these heavy sectors for the benefit of all Americans, and really to cross party lines in a way that results in healthy collaboration across the left and the right?
That is a very hard question because in some ways we've moved in a good direction and others bad. Well, first of all, I heartily agree with Congressman Casten about the challenges with the Senate. The filibuster is basically there just to stop progress, is to keep things from changing. And Sean mentioned 40 senators, when increasingly it looks like 30 senators represent 70% of the American people, and vice versa. The Senate's not at all representative of the American people. It's not easy to figure out how to change it, but if Democrats take back the Senate next year, they have a chance to do that. It was Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema that kept us from doing it the last time. But in general, when I first came to the House 10 years ago, climate change denial was the prevalence. It wasn't real. If it was real, we didn't cause it. If we did cause it, it's too late to do anything about it. The Republican presidents have moved in a much more positive direction on that. Where they have not moved is the willingness to join hands with us and actually offer solutions. And that is very frustrating. And Sean and I both trying to start every single piece of legislation with a Republican co-lead if possible. First of all, it's the best way to get things done. In the meantime, in the short run at least, for whatever reason, anytime a Republican tries to do something that's pro-environment, they feel like they're going to get punished by their voters. And therefore, it's very difficult for them to join with us. Easy to talk to them about it over coffee or a dinner party. Very difficult to get them to vote for it or to co-sponsor with us.
So
I hate to say that because I want us all to be working together, but I think that's the short-term reality.
So this is a challenge, as somebody who's been in the federal government, Lynda, you can also attest to. How do you message this? How do you share the benefits of decarbonization in transportation, something that everyday Americans and people around the world contend with, in a way that brings them on board? Because if we got the public on board, conceivably we would be able to solve many of these bottlenecks. So how do you think about messaging and communicating to, let's say, the American public in this case, but a global citizenship too?
Well, first of all, sometimes you don't call it that thing. Right. The secretary was very fond of saying some things we do, we trumpet, and some things we just do. So in the environment that we're in, and sometimes it's more bitter in certain districts and states than others, you choose your words very carefully. But the other thing I would just call out, and on the more positive, optimistic side of this, is it turns out when you hand out hundreds of billions of dollars, people from both sides of the aisle like to come to the television announcement for it. So, as the government, thanks to leaders like Representative Beyer and Representative Casten, as they are making policy that invests in our community, 60,000 of which now are benefiting from the IIJA alone, we should be hugging in people from both sides of the aisle so that they take credit for it and they feel that they see themselves and the stakes in the future in it as well. So that's one thing. But the second thing is, honestly, if we do our jobs well, the general public doesn't notice, right? They go about their lives, they get on a zero emission bus and they don't smell fumes and they're happy about it, but they may not even recognize it. And so I think that the biggest takeaway here is that sometimes we should be shouting it from the rooftops and saying, the future is at stake. And sometimes we should just do the work, make it happen, and then bring people around to us that way.
Okay, so that's the strategy from the government. Is that true for the companies as well? So curious about how your consumers are reacting to these new products that are being made available to them, or is it that they're not noticing potentially, right? Or are they responding? What are they actually responding to? Is it that it smells better? Is it that there's less noise? curious from your vantage point, what has been successful in terms of messaging?
I think that many of our customers, they really want to make this shift. They have the same type of ambitions that we do. So in that sense, it's really to tackle climate change, and they see that they want to make something that is good. As a very positive side effect, for example, if you have electric buses or if you have electric construction equipment machines, they are less noisy, they are less vibrations, which makes the work environment actually much better. So you can see that it's, you get a little bit prouder sitting in the driver's seat of an electric bus compared to another bus. Also, we can see that our customers are super happy about the fact that maybe they can change a little bit how they work. You can do deliveries during night because the electric truck is quiet. You could do work on work sites also during the nighttime because it's quiet. So there are many other types of benefits that goes together with the electric, and not the least in communities where you have lots of construction work, like here in Manhattan, we see all this construction work going on. Actually, air pollution would be much better if we would use electric machines, or in places where you have a lot of transportation. So lots of good side benefits.
Yes. You're from New York City when you don't notice those things in other parts of the world. And so somebody else will be pointing out how, even a baby crying, and you're like, a baby crying. Have you heard drilling in the middle of the night? Any given night in New York? So, okay, so there's benefits for the public, the consumer, and that's various ways we can message it, right? Some are to fly under the radar. Some are, it's just going to be better and more breathable for you in your future. But then there's that economics messaging too, right? There's a new entire workforce that we're creating thanks to these innovations that are coming to market, thanks to this accelerated transition to clean energy across transportation, across all these heavier to abate sectors. So Representative Casten, talk to us a little bit about what this green transition will be in terms of job creation across these sectors, and how do we, especially those who are in public elected positions, how do you guarantee that your constituents really benefit?
So number one, what I was saying before, and you can see this in data from the Fed, that since Joe Biden has come to office, once we got through the COVID downturn, every month the United States has created more jobs than workers. And that's the first time in about 2 decades that's happened, at least the 2 decades that I have data. Maybe that's more than that. That's just the data that we see in the Fed reports. That's huge. And it's because of the IRA. It's because of the IIJA. It's because of the CHIPS and Science Act. Those were policy decisions. And that's also why we're seeing wages increasing, particularly for lower income folks, faster than they have in a long time because we need them there. And that's fantastic. The proof is in the pudding. We're also seeing a lot more jobs created. There are many more green jobs being created than brown jobs lost. So that's positive. But, and this is where I think we need to be honest about some of the challenges. Investments in green energy are also investments in labor productivity. We should never shy away from investing in labor productivity, right? The steam shovel was a good thing, but we can still sympathize with John Henry. When you replace a coal plant with a solar farm, you not only don't need the coal miners anymore, but you don't need the fuel handlers and the rail workers who are managing it. You don't need the people, the welders who are replacing all the wear parts inside that coal plant. You don't need the ash handlers. Next time you drive by a solar farm, look for a parking lot. You don't see it because there's not a big employment group that's there. And I think we just heard about this from Volvo. One of the reasons to buy an electric vehicle is because the maintenance costs are so much lower. In addition to saving money on your fuel costs, you save money on maintenance. Well, that also means that there's not as many of those maintenance techs that are going. And so what we're seeing right now in the economy is a huge surge in construction jobs. And the jobs that we're losing in the brown sector tend to be operating jobs. For the next 10, 15 years, we're going to create more jobs than we're losing. But I think over time, we need to have a conversation about what does it look like in a world where we don't need as much labor to make a unit of energy. And again, every industry, if that was true when Detroit automated their assembly lines. It was true when Goldman Sachs automated their high-speed trading operations, right? The overall trend is to boost labor productivity. But there are political tensions that we can see in our society if we're not very intentional about making sure that the wealth that's created from that is not equitably shared. In the IRA, we were very intentional about saying that we want to prioritize projects in communities that were either historically affected by pollution and or are going to be disadvantaged in the future because of the energy transition. Part of the Republican-Democratic split on this is not innate to Republican philosophies or Democratic philosophies, but if you represent a place like New York that depends on turning raw materials into goods and services, at maximum value, there's an interest in places like New York, places like Chicago, in having cheap energy, and you're probably represented by a Democrat. If you live in rural America where it's easy to drill, it's easy to build mines and extraction resources, those areas are being left behind, and those areas have a rooting interest in higher cost energy. If you're an oil driller, you want the price of oil to be high, not low, right? And so we're seeing this wealth transfer from rural America to urban suburban America, which is coincidentally a transfer from red America to blue America. And I think we need to be very intentional and thoughtful about making sure that folks aren't left behind in that transition, are treated with dignity. Where retraining is appropriate, let's do it. Where you're past the point of retraining and frankly just wanted to work another 5 years to retirement, let's make sure that you got a cushion to do that too. And thank you for the service that you provided in getting our economy to where it was before. We've got time to go through that because we're creating so many jobs. But I don't think we should just duck that reality. We need to be, like I said at the start, love the steam shovel, also love John Henry.
Sure, fair point. Very thoughtful. And so as we wrap up, I'm going to bring this to the global kind of view because we do have a Swedish company after all as part of this conversation. And so curious, Representative Beyer, what your thoughts are on how America can lead with all of the efforts that have already actually been disseminated, right? So all the efforts that have been underway with the IRA and the various bills and policies that have been raised in this conversation and seeing it roll out, how does that then allow America to lead on the global stage? How do we serve as an example for other countries who are trying to follow suit?
I love your question. I went to Denmark, Copenhagen in 2009 for COP15, where that was the one where famously the new President Barack Obama parachuted in at the last minute to save it. But the great embarrassment there was that the U.S. had done virtually nothing for decade after decade. And we were there expected to lead the rest of the world, but we weren't leading at home. Now we're in a very different position with the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and all the other things we've done to lead by example and to be pressing people to come along with us. There's another interesting thing. We now have this, global competition with China for who writes the rules of the road for this century. But it's also a competition over who can electrify more quickly. They've been, very successful with their low-priced $20,000 BYD electric vehicles, even threatening what's going on in this country. But it's exciting to have that competition. One of the shortcomings, I think, in the Inflation Reduction Act was in our emphasis on domestic content, on building up the industrial base in the United States. We left out a lot of our long-term trading partners. EU, UK, Japan, and others. And we've been struggling to catch up and make sure that they're part of the family in terms of all these engagements. But, we are still the preeminent influencer of the rest of the world, and we need to use our diplomacy and our economic heft to get everybody to come along with us. Okay,
well, I kind of wanted to clap it to that, but that seems a little biased. But do you agree, Lynda, from your point of view?
It gives me great faith and confidence to hear Representative Beyer talk about our place in the world and the need to focus on that more. We've been very much talking about electrification of passenger vehicles and heavy-duty trucks as part of this conversation, but there is a very serious role for the U.S. government to play more broadly across the transportation sector, whether we're talking about sustainable aviation fuel, which was part of the Inflation Reduction Act as well, or maritime, or electric aircraft. I mean, there is an ongoing push all around the world to make progress across all of these different modes, and we ought to be leaders. That's bottom line.
No, thank you for that. And so I'm going to final word to you, Karin. So is the United States still in a position as somebody who's coming from a European point of view, is the United States still in a position to be able to do what we've been hearing with these various representatives of the US will we be able to succeed in that? And where does it compare to the rest of the world?
I think for us, US is actually the biggest market for us. So it's super important that US is successful, that we can work together, that we get the support to make this transition happening. So I would say that all the prerequisites are in place. This conversation, I think, shows that there is lots of hopes and opportunities in this country. So I'm just looking forward to continue the collaboration with all of you.
Okay. And thank you for all of your perspectives and for the hopeful nature of this conversation, because this is not an easy thing to do, but the writing is on the wall. We are accelerating the transition to clean energy, and of course, transportation and construction has to be part of that big global effort. So thank you all for your contributions, and have an incredible rest of New York Climate Week.
Thank you.
Thank you.